Hello, I'm Gary Schaefer, Director of Glendale Library Arts and Culture. On behalf of all the public libraries in Los Angeles, Ventura counties, and beyond, thank you for joining the Southern California Library Cooperative and my library for this event, which is part of our series, Be the Change, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism. Be the Change events build collective understanding of systemic racism, elevate the voices and stories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and inspire our communities to be the change. The series is generously supported by the City of Glendale Arts and Culture Commission, as well as Outlook newspapers. Tonight, in honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are pleased to be hosting Paula Yoo and Janice Rochelle Littlejohn. Paula Yoo is an author, screenwriter, and musician. Her latest young adult nonfiction book, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, The Killing of Vincent Chin and the Trial That Galvanized the Asian American Movement, is a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard selection and has received 5-star reviews from Kirkus Reviews, ALA Booklist, Hornbook, Publishers Weekly, and School Library Journal. Janice Rochelle Littlejohn is a journalist, author, and essayist covering women, culture, and media. She contributes to Miss Magazine and Shondaland Digital Media, among others. Janice is the Associate Director of the Los Angeles Institute of the Humanities at USC. We encourage during the talk that you email questions throughout to libraryinfo@glendaleca.gov. Please notice it on your screen, or you can use the live chat in YouTube. And now I'll turn the virtual mic over to Janice. Janice? Janice, you're muted, I'm sorry.
I forgot that I was muted. Okay. All right, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight for this discussion with Paula Yoo about her book, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry. And the book is centered on the brutal killing of 27-year-old Vincent Chin on the night of his bachelor party and the subsequent Asian American movement that ignited in Detroit and around the country when his assailants were not convicted for his crime. We're speaking tonight 2 days since the House passed the Hate Crimes Act on what would have been Vincent Chin's 66th birthday. Paula, we've talked about this book a lot, and this is a very tough, no-holds-barred story to read. And I can only imagine it was a wrenching one to investigate and to have to write. But it is indeed a very necessary story to be told. And I wanted to first ask you, why did you want to take this on?
After several years of working on it, I asked myself that question too. No. Oh, and by the way, I'd like to say hi and thank you, obviously, to the library, and thank you everyone for having us here tonight. I'm looking forward to our discussion. To answer your question, I actually heard about Vincent Chin when I was in college because the Oscar-nominated documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin had been released. And I was an English major in college, and then I got my master's in journalism, and I was working at the Seattle Times in 1993 when I got a job offer to be a feature writer at the Detroit News. And that's when Vincent Chin crossed my mind again. And myself and my Asian American journalist friends, we all thought it's a great job opportunity, but what about Vincent Chin? That's the city where he was killed, and the two killers, you know, they got away with it. You know, is it safe for you to go there? And I will cut to the chase and say, of course, I took the job. I met my future husband and my future lifelong best friends in Detroit. So I'm Detroit strong. We go back every year to Michigan to see family and friends. And for those of you who are from Detroit, I'm Lafayette Coney Dog. I'm Lafayette. They'll know what that means. And so it was obviously a positive experience for me. But while I was there, that's when I had thought about Vincent Chin, and then I just did my journalism career, and then went on, and we'll talk a little bit more about my writing journey. But I thought about Vincent Chin. He came up a lot because every now and then I would think he would make a great movie, because in addition to doing journalism, I left journalism to become a TV writer, producer, and I write films as well. And of course I do my books. And every now and then when I have some free time, I thought, what's my passion screenplay? And I thought I really want to do something on Vincent Chin. And in 2018, my book agent and I were having a conversation, what's your next book? And I mentioned, well, I really want to take some time and go back and see if I can tackle this Vincent Chin story. And my book editor said, that should be a book. And I realized she was right, because if you, there's so much in this story, as you know, from reading the book, that doing a movie would just be a very tiny slice of life and would not do justice to the entire story. And because there is I'm the only full-length book completely about this case. There are chapters in other books and chapters in other textbooks, but no full book. So I realized, I need to do the book first, and I'm actually very glad. So that's kind of how the book happened. And so I guess I would say, because I'm a Gen Xer and I was in Detroit in my early 20s, if you do the math, Vincent Chin has been on my mind for more than half my life.
Yes. Well, it definitely, through everything that you've put in this book, it encompasses so much, and we'll talk about a little bit of that later. But one of the things that I was interested in, and I know you've been asked this before, it's a very tough subject, and a lot of twists and turns in the legal system, and racism and violence. And it's a YA title. And I was wondering, can you talk about why this book became a young adult title?
Of course. I want to say right off the bat, I wrote the book for everyone. So there is no censoring of language. There is no sanitizing of what happened. It was a brutal, violent crime. There are certain words that are said, like mother F dash dash dash. I don't say dash 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 in the book. I spell it out. And the type of writing that I did for it and the research that I did was no different than if I was writing an adult novel, or doing a newspaper report and things like, writing for the newspaper and things like that. So it was definitely written for everyone. But the reason why it is geared towards the young adult market, and I'll talk a little bit more about why specifically it does actually work for the YA audience, which means young adult for high school students. Pretty much, I think it's ages 13 or 14 and up. And the reason why is because Asian American Pacific Islander history is very rarely, if ever, taught in the K through 12 classrooms in our country. And if it is taught, it's just a little, here's the thing on Chinese Lunar New Year, or here's 2 paragraphs in a history book about the illegal incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll find out about the Korean War, the Chinese Railroad, but very, very very little of our AAPI history is taught in schools. And growing up, I didn't have any of it either. And in fact, when I was in my early 20s, I would go to that tiny little Asian bookshelf at Barnes and Noble or at your bookstore and just desperately teach myself. I'd be like, oh, I really need to know exactly what happened to my parents in the Korean War. I'm going to get this book out. I'm going to get this. And I basically am self-taught. So I don't want teenagers to go through what I went through, to have that gap. And the danger of Asian erasure in our education system is that today, the recent statistic came out that 1 out of 4 Asian American and Pacific Islander teenagers have said that they have been victims of either physical or verbal bullying and harassment because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if this history had been taught this whole time, it would have humanized our community and taught people that we have faced centuries of violent racism, but there's also centuries of Asian American Pacific Islander joy and positive contributions to this country. It would have humanized us, and maybe that number today would have been 0 out of 4. So those are the reasons. And we can talk a little bit more about Jared as well, but there's a character in the book that I think also makes the book really helpful for teenagers.
Well, actually, let's talk about Jared a little bit because he is who we are introduced to in this book. And he's someone that you're thinking we're going to learn all about this Vincent Chin guy, but then there's Jared, and Jared has a very interesting history with Vincent, even though they never met and he never heard about him. Can you talk a little bit about who Jared is and why he's important to this book?
Of course I will. And I just realized maybe some people have not read the book yet. So if you don't mind, I think I just want to briefly walk you through what happened so we can actually understand what's going on.
Alrighty.
So yeah, so June 19th, 1982, Vincent Chin was 27. He was going to get married in the next 10 days. He and his childhood friend, Gary, and his two other friends, Bob and Jimmy, decided bachelor party. So they ended up going to some bars and they ended up at an adult entertainment nightclub with professional dancers. It was called the Fancy Pants Club and it was in Highland Park, which is just outside Detroit. And while they were there, two white men also entered the club. It was Ronald Ebens, who was in his early 40s, and his stepson, 24-year-old Michael Nitz. They ended up sitting across the catwalk from Vincent and his bachelor party. Now, this is 1982. There are no iPhones. There's no surveillance cameras. This is a case of he said, she said, which I will go into more detail in a second. But basically, it is alleged, and in court testimony, witnesses claim that they heard anti-Asian racist slurs such as chink and nip, which was a slur back in the 80s. It basically meant Jap. And they heard these slurs coming from the direction of where Ebens and Nitz were sitting. So Vincent got up, walked over, a fight occurred, chairs were thrown. It was awful. They got kicked out. Fight continued in the parking lot. Ebens and Nitz had a baseball bat in the trunk of their car because they belonged to a baseball amateur league. They loved baseball. They were actually on their way to a Tigers game. And so they pull out the bat. Vincent runs down Woodward Avenue. His friend Jimmy runs after him. Gary and Bob get in the car to try to find them because they don't have cell phones. They can't call each other and tell them where they are. I'm on the corner of 5th and Main. They can't do that. Ebens and Nitz get in the car. They also drive off. Even the stepson and stepfather find Vincent and Jimmy first. They had ended up outside a McDonald's about maybe half a mile down the road. They were sitting outside hoping Gary and Bob would pick them up. Instead, Ebens and Nitz came onto them first, saw them, got triggered again, pulled out the baseball bat, and then that's when Vincent was beaten by Ebens into a coma right outside that McDonald's. 4 days later, they had to take him off life support and he died. Instead of the wedding, everyone went to the funeral. Cut to a year later, they were actually charged with second-degree murder. It got reduced to manslaughter. They pled guilty to manslaughter, but the judge felt bad for them. And he said, listen, these aren't the kind of people you send to prison. Let the punishment fit the criminal, not the crime, because they had never done anything like this before. They had no criminal records. And so to the judge, based on the limited information that he had, he decided this was really a case of toxic masculinity and too much alcohol and, just things went awry. So they were given a $3,000 fine each and 3 years probation. This immediately angered the Asian American community in Detroit, led to national protests, which then led to a federal indictment and the first federal civil rights trial for an Asian American. The stepson Nitz was cleared of both charges, but Ebens was found guilty of violating Vincent Chin's civil right to be in a place of public accommodation on account of his race, which was the Fancy Pants Club. And but unfortunately, due to a technical error in the trial, they had to have it was appealed and the guilty conviction was overturned. So to this day, both Ebens and Nitz, technically in a court of law, are not guilty of violating Vincent Chin's civil rights. But although we lost that battle, we didn't lose the war because Vincent Chin's name became basically a rallying cry, basically became a symbol for anti-Asian racism. And we can go a little bit more into the details.
Yeah, because you talked a little bit earlier about the coronavirus and the escalation of anti-Asian hate in this country since then. And, it seems that history is repeating itself because Vincent was killed because he was an Asian American at a time in the 1980s when Asian Americans were being scapegoated as a means to justify Detroit's economic woes, as American car factory workers were being laid off, and Egan's was certainly among them. And in the book, you've noted that journalist Helen Zia had written at the time that it felt dangerous to have an Asian face during that period. And this same kind of scapegoating is going on now after Trump insisted on nicknaming the coronavirus the China virus or Kung flu. And it's resulted in an escalation of hate crimes against Asian Americans even today. And I wanted to know, in this current climate, what has it been like being out promoting this book? And does this hate resurgence against Asian American and Pacific Islanders galvanize you even more to get the word out about Vincent's story?
These are great questions, and I will circle back to Jared as well. To answer your question, first of all, I don't like to go out. Even before they started reporting in the national news that the crimes had been going up, early on in the pandemic, family members reported being on airplanes where passengers refused to sit next to them. I was racially profiled outside my house where someone thought I was going to give their kid the virus, even though we were more than 6 feet apart, pulled their child close to them. White people have refused to get on elevators with me, even though it's COVID and we have the masks and things like that. So I'm not happy going out. And and I think that the scapegoating that happened in the 1980s, what happened back then was the American auto industry was kind of resting on their laurels because the big three in Michigan, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, those were great jobs. You had benefits. It was the American dream come true. But we had an oil crisis and gas prices started to go up. So then these import cars from Japan were smaller and more fuel efficient. Instead of the auto industry saying, hey, let's take accountability, just like today with our government saying, let's take accountability for maybe not reacting quickly enough due to all the coronavirus reports we were hearing that were coming through. Maybe we should have reacted a little bit faster like Italy did, because Italy shut down very quickly. They had their lockdown. They had to find a scapegoat. So back in the 80s, there are photos, I will show some at the end, of auto workers would bash in. It was for $1, you can take a sledgehammer and bash in a Jap import car. And so they used Japan as a scapegoat. There was a politician who called Honda, quote unquote, the little yellow people. Mm-hmm. He would later apologize for that, but he shouldn't have said that in the first place. And it's the same thing now with the parallels are pretty incredible. And I will say that after Atlanta, that's when my life kind of blew up. I think the book went a little viral because my phone was ringing off the hook with interviews and people wanting to talk about Vincent Chin. So I think that really affected, we knew the book was important, but we had no idea about the timing. And in fact, there is an afterword in my book about coronavirus, the China virus, the prejudice that is so hauntingly similar today like it was in the 1980s. And I'll tell you now, when I wrote that afterward, the first time I wrote it was the end of May 2020. And the opening line was, as I write this, more than 100,000 Americans have died from the COVID-19 virus. Think about that. We had to go through several more edits, and every time I had to go back, I had to cross out that number and add another 100,000, and it broke my heart. And just going back very quickly to Jared.
Yes.
Yeah, Jared Wu, he is what I consider the guide, the river guide for the young adult high school reader and actually for anyone, because the 1980s, I'm a Gen Xer, it seems like yesterday, but this happened, the 40th anniversary is next year. This is 40 years ago. So Jared is a young millennial, and he found out that his mom was Vicky Wong, the woman who was supposed to marry Vincent Chin. He didn't know for 30 years. Hidden history, didn't know about it. And my book opens with his cousin calling and say, oh my God, today's the 30th anniversary. Don't talk to your mom about that guy. And Jared's like, what guy? And his cousin says, you don't know about Vincent Chin? And Jared's words were, who's Vincent Chin? He Googles Vincent Chin. And then he sees a picture from a 1982 article from Detroit, and it shows a picture of a young Vincent Chin with his arm around a beautiful young woman. And that's when Jared told me in our interview, I recognized my mom right away. And that broke my heart. And so basically, the book, there are two storylines. One is the Vincent Chin story, the killing, the trial, the aftermath, the legacy. The other storyline is Jared discovering this family secret, trying to work up the courage to talk to his mother and confront her about why did you keep this a secret? We need to talk about Vincent Chin. So you find out how he works up the courage and what happens when he finally talks to his mom. And I think Jared represents the teenager today, the millennials today, even all of us, you know, Gen Xers and baby boomers, a lot of people who have forgotten or never knew who Vincent Chin was. We're living the story. I think the book would have worked fine without Jared, but I think having Jared makes it more relevant and special. And I think it also shows you how history unfortunately repeats itself.
And it connects generations, you know. Jared is really an interesting catalyst for the story because he connects us to the past, to the present, to the fact that this is a history that is so unknown that he didn't even know that his own mother was a part of it.
Yeah, and even the coincidences. I wrote a Medium essay about this, but when he's a talented professional photographer, so I actually hired him to help take photos during my trips to Detroit for research. And we actually paid our respects at Vincent Chin and his parents' grave. And while we were there with our moment of silence, even he didn't tell his mom that he was working with me on the book because he just didn't want to trigger her. He didn't want to, it's the worst day of her life. He doesn't want to constantly bring it up. So he didn't mention, he just said, Mom, I'm going to be working. It's a freelance photo assignment. While we were there doing our moment of silence, his phone rings and it was his mom. She just wanted to say hi and say, hey, you want to come over for dinner? I haven't seen you in a while. And that freaked us out. We were, to me, I don't think that was a coincidence. I really do think that was Vincent kind of reaching out and saying, hey, don't forget about me.
Mm-hmm.
This is important what you're doing.
Well, you know, going back a little bit, you mentioned earlier about the trial and then the movement that started in Detroit, but it also mushroomed in cities throughout the United States and in Chicago and San Francisco and other places. Tell us about the circumstances that prompted this event to become this national movement for Asian American civil rights.
Of course. Well, first of all, the term Asian American is a political term. We often talk about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. There's also, you know, Hawaiian. There's all these different, the labels and the terms are always evolving. But Asian American was a term that was coined in the 1960s by two young college activists, Asian Americans. And so this term actually has existed for decades. And back in the 1960s, Asian American college activists were protesting the Vietnam War. They were marching arm in arm with the Black Panthers. They were in solidarity with the Black Civil Rights Movement. So the Asian Americans have been protesting for decades, if not centuries. So that's another, I think, an urban myth where people are like, oh, finally, the Asians are protesting because of Atlanta and coronavirus. It's like, no, we've been doing this for a while. So that's the history behind the term. But in the 1980s, in 1982, when Vincent Chin was killed, you were either Korean American, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, you know, Filipino. You were not Asian American. Asian American was just, oh, the radical college students. It's their political thing. So when Vincent Chin happened, you had grandmas and grandpas and aunties and uncles and people from all walks of life. Realizing, no, I want to be an Asian American too, because we have to get together and fight as a community. So Vincent Chin, the Asian American political movement had already existed, but Vincent Chin made it mainstream for the average family person. Just you didn't have to be an activist. It included all of us. So that's why the Vincent Chin case was so important in terms of galvanizing and mainstreaming the Asian American political consciousness.
Okay. Well, I also wanted to talk about the allyship between African Americans, Black Americans, and Asian communities, because one of the things that was really wonderfully highlighted in this book and really touched me was how much the alliances between these two two minority groups, if you will, coming together to promote justice and to support one another. And I was just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about some of those alliances and maybe the history a little bit of Black and Asian unity that provided such an important benchmark for us right now.
No, that's a great question, and I'd love to talk about it. I mean, first of all, every single Asian American activist that was involved in the original case told me over and over, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Black community in Detroit, because Horace Sheffield, who was one of the activists, the Black activist leader in Detroit, and Congressman Conyers, Reverend Jesse Jackson, they all banded together to protest this injustice. And in fact, it wasn't, not only did it galvanize the Asian American community in Detroit, it also brought in churches and synagogues, the Latino, Latinx community, the Black community. Everyone came together. It was a very multicultural, very diverse coalition that happened. So, and I think that goes back, I mentioned earlier that Asian American college activists were very much, pro Black Panther. They were at those protest rallies and civil rights. There's Grace Lee Boggs, famous Asian American activist for Black civil rights. So all of that exists, but instead, all we ever hear about are the images of anti-Blackness, like going back to the LA riots, even today, we're seeing certain images of anti-Asian racism, and we're seeing some of the people that are the perpetrators who happen to be Black and Latinx. And what's interesting is that that's the problem with media coverage and education of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. It's very convenient. It fits the white mainstream supremacist viewpoint of how they want to pit other minority groups against each other. For example, they just came out with a survey. It was listed at NPR and some other places. And forgive me, I don't have the exact number, but it's something like 89 to 90% of all the anti-Asian hate crimes happening right now because of the pandemic are perpetrated by white people.
Mm-hmm.
But what are we seeing, in the media? And then when Atlanta happened, what did they say? They said he had a bad day. And they said it wasn't a racist hate crime. Maybe it was anti-woman, but it wasn't racist. And of course, thankfully, one of the prosecutors is now going to pursue racist hate crime charges for the Atlanta shooter. And and I think that that's the problem. It's like, and I do want to take a step back and say, does anti-Blackness, does certain prejudices and discrimination exist in the AAPI community? Of course, just like certain prejudices and other types of hatred exists in the Black community. There's homophobia in both communities. There's also, then you have the Latino, the Latinx community. There's a lot. No one's perfect. Everyone has a blind spot. Everyone has their prejudices, but I think that because we erase the positive bonds and the positive solidarity, the fact that the Black and Asians have been fighting long before the LA riots, there was a big coalition, the Korean and Black communities to come together and overcome our differences after the LA riots. A lot of that was happening before the LA riots too. There are so many local Asian American activist organizations all over the country that nobody knows about. These nonprofit organizations, they've been fighting this from day one. They've been trying to raise awareness, we have to fight anti-Black racism. These groups are out there, but none of this gets covered. So we have a very skewed and very unfair, very thin slice of the bigger picture. So that frustrates me. And that's why I wrote in this book, I wanted to not only write about Asian pain and let you know that, there's a lot of pain in our history. I also wanted to celebrate Asian joy. I wanted to celebrate these incredible bonds of solidarity between the Asian American and the African American communities in Detroit in the early 1980s. We can't forget that, because then that just leads again to all this very skewed media representation, and that frustrates me.
Yeah, and it's like you said earlier, these things are not being taught in our schools, they're not in our textbooks, these organizations are not highlighted in our education system. So it gives a very skewed perspective on what the alliance is, allyship, if you will, of not only Black and Asians, but of other minority groups or BIPOC, if you will, people of color, Indigenous and Black people. So it it makes it so much more important. I think, you know, I don't want to oversell it, but you know, this is one of those books where when you started talking about it, I kept thinking, I've heard of this Vincent Chin person. Why do I know this? Because I was in high school in the 80s, and you know, I have friends and family or adopted family, if you will, family that chosen family, I guess is the word, who are Japanese American. And it's one of those stories that when you started writing about it on social media, I kept thinking, I know this story. Why don't I know more about this story? And so it's a really important discussion that you're having, and I'm so glad that we're able to talk about it. And before I know you have a lot of great photographs, and I want to get to that, but there is a question that came up early when we started talking, and I just want to address it from Carmen Gonzalez. She had a question for you. Do you find older generations seem to have a different approach to addressing racialized hate? So I'm thinking older generations might be boomers, because I too am an Xer. So
Well, that's a good question. It's funny in terms of talking about generations. One of the stereotypes for the Asian American community is that the older generation, we're quiet, we don't rock the boat. You know, we just want to just kind of have the American dream and not, and that's actually, that's a BS stereotype. That's not true. We've been rocking the boat, you know, for a very long time. And, but to be fair, yeah, it's human nature. Nobody likes conflict. I just want to have my sandwich and play with my cats. I don't want to get into a fight on Twitter again. You know, so I mean, it's human nature to want to avoid conflict. But what I thought was interesting was in 1982, Helen Zia, Roland Wong, Jim Shimura, all the people involved, they were the original millennials. They were in their early 20s and early 30s. They're baby boomers now, but they were the youth generation, and they fought back. And so now that they're baby boomers, when I talk to them, I still see them as 25, not 65 and say, you know, I mean, Jim Schumer's almost 70, and he still talks and acts just like an angry 25-year-old from Detroit. It's great. And so I think that, and also what was interesting was there was one woman in the book that I interviewed. Her name was Mabel Lim. And she was a grandmother, and she was born in 1920 in Detroit, Chinese American. And she was this, you know, this old lady, and she said, you know what, give me the flyers. I'll go walk around and hand out the flyers. This woman in her 60s walking down the streets of Detroit going, hey, we want justice for Vincent Chin. So I think too that activism is an evolving thing. Like it's you can change. People who were quiet their whole lives finally started speaking out, because Vincent Chin inspired a lot of the elderly in Detroit's Chinatown to say, you know what, I'm sick of all the racism that I've tried to be quiet, you know, behave, try not to rock the boat. I'm rocking the boat now. So I think that, so, you know, I think that you're never too old to become a young activist, you know? So I think if anything, and so I do think that generationally, we do have the trope, we have the stereotype of the older generation was quiet, and it's up to the younger people to carry the mantle. But I think Vincent Chin proved that you could pick up the mantle at any age, because that's what we saw. We saw a cross section of all generations.
Yeah. Well, you know, most movements throughout history, if we look at them, start with the young, and they bring in others. You know, the movements now for Black Lives, that it's started by young people, but, you know, Xers are there, boomers are there. I think it's just, it's one of those cyclical things that the young get started and everybody comes in, especially when it's something that is, at least in civil rights movements across this country, we all have to be involved, and we all have to, and a lot of the pictures that you have, and I'd like you to show us some of that, because a lot of what you've shown us or show in the book and the photos that you have really do illuminate the fact that we're all in this together. And if you could take a little moment, because there's a lot of really great pictures I'd like you to show and discuss, because you know, we can't do this alone, and it's very evident by not only the books and the photos in the book, but the photos that you have.
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. And before I do want to just say one thing that Helen Zia and everybody taught me was that you. Even if you're not a lawyer or a politician, or you know, you're just a student, or you know, you're just working your job, and you know, it just doesn't matter how big or small you feel. All it takes is one person, you know. And so, for example, I'm wearing this T-shirt, says Asian Heroes Matter. It's from a company called Black Heroes Matter, and I also wear this proudly all the time. So I like to support Black businesses. My book, it's available for signing at Isowan Bookstore, which is, you know, one of the oldest Black-owned bookstores in LA. And then I also, when I go out, I wear this button.
I love that.
Let's wash your hands and don't be racist, from Inclusive Randomness, which is another Black-owned business. It's a lovely young woman who does these really fun buttons and things like that. So, I mean, I'm just saying this too to say, you know, we can rage donate. We can find out the local, you know, the local chapter of whatever activist organizations are out there. I mean, they exist. So there are ways that we can help. So just to show you, I am going to now share the screen.
Okie dokie.
All right, here we go. All right, so now I'm going to hit play. So since we were talking, what I want to show is, I just want to talk very briefly about my research. As a former journalist, did a ton of research. So this is at the Bentley Museum in University of Michigan, where, because this was the 1980s, nothing was digitized. It's a big dusty box. They didn't have Twitter or email or social media. So I look at this as old school Twitter, where instead of rage tweeting, people are writing angry letters, you know, to the newspapers about what happened to Vincent Chin. This is one of the flyers that people handed out back then. You know, instead of an Evite or a Zoom invite, it was a piece of paper that someone would hand to you. This is an example of the thousands of pages of court transcripts I went through. This is just how I organized my binders. There's my cat Oreo, just to show you a frame of reference. Now we're going to go into the club. This was the Fancy Pants Club that the bachelor party took place, where Ebens and Nitz met Vincent Chin. This is the baseball bat that was used to beat him into a coma. This is the McDonald's where he fell into a coma. His last words were, "It's not fair." And these are the two police officers. That's Morris Cotton is on the right, Michael Gardenhire on the left. They both testified at the trial as well. This is the Fancy Pants Club today. I actually went there on June 19th, 2018. So I went there on the actual day that Vincent was killed. So just showing you, it used to be a movie theater, and then it became, you know, an adult entertainment nightclub. Those are the stairs. I ran up the stairs, and Jared was with me, and my husband was with me, and they screamed. They said, "What are you doing? Be careful." And I realized why I should have been careful when I ran up those stairs. That's what it looked like inside. This is me taking a picture from the other side. Luckily, I didn't fall into the giant hole. We then drove down Woodward Avenue. This is the exact part of the street that Vincent Chin ran from the nightclub down the street to the McDonald's. This is the McDonald's today. This is where he was killed. This is Gary Koivu, one of the best friends. They knew each other since the first grade. They were best friends, and he was going to go to the wedding. He was the first person Vincent called. This is Gary Koivu today. This is Helen Zia, the amazing journalist and activist. This is her today. This is Jim Shimura, one of the lawyers, and this is Jim Shimura and Roland Huang. I actually just did a Detroit Public TV town hall the other day with the both of them, and they're fantastic. I just adore them. This is Morris Cotton, the police officer who arrested Ebens and Nitz. This is him today. He became the first Black police chief of police at Highland Park Police Department. And his story, he has an incredible story himself. This is the woman on the right with the cool glasses is Anna Diggs Taylor. She was a young lawyer in 1964, and she actually recruited Black voters. She was trying to help register Black voters in Mississippi. And that was when the 2 white activists and the 1 Black activist were murdered and killed by the KKK. And she was there during that, the whole Mississippi burning summer of 1964. That would inspire her to become the first Black female judge appointed to the federal bench in Michigan by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. So the other thing that my book does is I look at everyone's backstory, because every single person involved in this case has an incredible personal history. This is me from 1994 in Detroit outside my apartment. As you can see, I haven't changed my style or my hairstyle. And this is me outside the mural of, unfortunately, this building was demolished earlier this year. So I'm glad we got a chance to take a picture of this mural that was there. And then this is the photo that Jared Lew saw and said, I recognized my mom right away. This is Jared Lew today. This is when I visited him. He's hired him. He's an amazing photographer. He's been published in the New York Times and other places. He's incredible. I'm his Korean auntie. So I always call him and say, are you eating? This is Corky Lee. He is a famous Chinese American photographer. He is known as the unofficial Asian American photographer laureate because for 50 years, he chronicled live photojournalism of important iconic moments in contemporary Asian American history, including the Vincent Chin case. So I want to show you some of the photos that he took. His photos are in my book. So this was the Detroit protest, which then sparked a wildfire of protests across the country. So these are, and Roland Huang, Helen Zia, Jim Schmoor, they're all there. And this is in Detroit. Now I'm showing you this picture. This was Vincent Chin's great-great-grandfather was one of the Chinese laborers who helped build the Continental Railroad. And when in 1896, the Golden Spike moment where from the East Coast to the West Coast met in the middle of the country, do you see there's not a single, do you see any Chinese people in that photo? Nope. None of the thousands of Chinese laborers who risked their lives and died to build the railroad were in this photo. This is deliberate erasure of Asian American history. And I'll give you another thing. Back then, the Chinese laborers were asked to carry the dynamite, which was very volatile. And they had to carry it because their lives were cheaper compared to the white laborers. They didn't want to lose more money by having a white laborer die. So they had to, so they died. They don't even get to be in the picture. Corky Lee reconstructed that photo with the children and the grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren of these laborers. So this is us reclaiming our history. And I'm bringing this up because you know how I said in my afterword, I wrote when more than 100,000 people have died from COVID-19. I had to keep adding more and more people to the number. We can add Corky Lee. He died of COVID-19 in January of 2021, and it broke my heart. So I wanted to show this as a tribute to him. This is his famous photo of the protest in Detroit where it was, "It's not fair." And American Citizens for Justice was founded by Helen Zia, Jin, and Roland, and all the people that you saw. This organization still exists today, and they still fight for justice for not just Asian Americans, but all Americans. And so you can see going from the past to the present. I told you, we've been protesting forever, and we get results. Look at this. And then what just happened today? They said President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. So it just takes one person, man. It just takes one person. And this is just showing you, we were talking earlier about the Black and Asian relationship. This is a famous photo of Jesse Jackson hugging a devastated Lily Chin. But I wanted to show you this next picture because I feel that, again, we have a skewed media coverage of our relationship. Look at that. Look at that amazing photo. They're laughing and smiling. Look at that. We need more. This existed, and I don't know why we're not showing this. You know, the power of this image to show that, are there problems between our communities? Of course there are. There are problems between all our communities, but there's also bridges that have been forged, and we need to celebrate and keep those bridges from falling down. And this is because of that. Look at what the young kids today are doing, you know, Asians for Black Lives. You know, and I'll say, as a Korean American, there is no exact Korean phrase for Black Lives Matter. And after the LA riots and the history today, the Korea has their own phrase for Black Lives Matters, and it translates literally to Black lives are precious. So I just want to show that, you know, we need to keep showing the healing that's happening between our communities. And then I just wanted to end with past to present. Past to present. It's the same. And then also I just want to show you the family is together. They're together, thankfully. And this is a mile marker. This is actually what inspired the title of my book, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry. And just wanted to end on that image.
You know, I do love that that you have all the images, and the one that you showed right before the last, Vincent Chin's final words, "It's not fair." I read this book, what, 3 or 4 months ago, and it's still ringing in my ears every time there is a hate crime perpetrated. And, you know, we have about 15 minutes left, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. In the book, you quote a California congressman who said, after Vincent was killed, that we must prevent violent bigotry from striking again. This country depends on our success. But yet we still have violence, we still have bigotry. And I was wondering, even with it, we have a win, you know, we have a win with the hate crime bill that President Biden just passed. But how can we do better? I mean, how do we make the steps forward that we need to make toward this more perfect union?
That's a really good question. I think part of it, the obvious question is, every month is Asian American Pacific Islander Month. Every month is Mental Awareness Health Month. Every month is Black History Month. Every month is LGBTQ, you know, Latino heritage. Like it should be every day. Now, having said, you know, and I often say this, you know, if you want to stop the hate, you have to educate. But aside from that, I'm going to say something. It's exhausting. I've done so many Zooms, the emotional labor it takes for activists to go out and march, to raise money, the frustrating grant writing they have to do for their nonprofit organizations, the uphill battle for this COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, you know, the fact that so many Republicans fought against it, the uphill battle that Senator Mazie Hirono and Representative Grace Meng had to do to get this passed, you know, it's exhausting. So what I would suggest is our allies and our friends, you have to help us. You know, I need a day off. So maybe on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm going to protest. Tuesdays and Thursdays, non-Asian people, you know, white, Black, you know, like you take up the mantle. And on those days, I'm going to fight for the LGBTQ community. I'm going to fight for, you know, Black Heroes Matter. You know, you know what I mean? We have to take turns. Like, let's, you know, I think what it is, of course I'm going to be against anti-Asian racism. I don't want someone to spit on me. I don't want to be the next elderly Asian that gets knocked down on the sidewalk. I mean, that's horrifying to me. But at the same time, I think, and that's the thing, people are like, well, of course, you know, you're Asian. Of course you're against anti-Asian racism. But you know what? I'm also against anti-Black racism. You know, you know, we should be talking about defiant race. We should be talking about Black Lives Matters. So I think that's what it is. We need to see people from other communities. We need to cross-pollinate.
Right.
And because we do that, we're #stronger together. You know, it's like the bridge is getting stronger and stronger. So that's really, I think, ultimately what we need to do. And I think also we have to do the work ourselves. It's like, let me read books on Black civil rights history. I don't need someone to give me a lecture. Let me do my homework first.
Mm.
So if you're not Asian, do the homework for our community. If you're not Black, do the homework for that community. So it's that's what it is. It's never ending, and so we're all going to be exhausted. So we have to help lift each other up.
Yes. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to get that last question in, unless we have any other. I don't think we have any more questions from the room, but we do. Carmen Gonzalez asks again, the presence of cell phone video helps bring justice to George Floyd's murder. Do you think things would have been different for Vincent Chin had the same technology been around then?
Carmen is asking, dropping the mic. She's asking good questions. Thank you, Carmen. Yes and no, because here's the thing. There was a video for Rodney King.
Mm-hmm.
There was video for Rodney King, and look what happened.
Yeah.
So, and George Floyd could have gone the other way. I mean, there was a lot of half glass empty moments for us before the verdicts came down, and there was a sense of relief. There shouldn't be a sense of relief. There should have been a sense of, well, of course. And so that's the problem. Even if there is video, and there have been videos, how many videos have we seen of elderly Asians being knocked down on the sidewalk, or that kind of, there is evidence out there. Having said that, being a half glass full person, I do think that had there been technology back then, that could have helped. But I think also back in the 1980s, you have to remember, racism back then was very simple. It was very cut and dried. You either wore a KKK robe and a hood, or you didn't. In things like internalized racism and internalized bias, terms like racial microaggressions, all these terms that we know of today, privilege, entitlement, the Karens, and so forth, none of that existed in the 1980s. So back then it was very confusing. It was like, well, he never actually said, it can't be proven that he said the word chink. He said little mother effers, that could have meant anyone. It's like, no, you can't be splitting hairs. Racism was splitting hairs back then. It was very much, you're either in the KKK or you're not. And so I think that even with the visual evidence, I don't know, because the conversation was a lot more simplistic back then. But having said that, despite the nuances and the terms that we all know today, there's still a lot of people out there who say, I'm not racist because, I have Black friends, or I'm married, I have an Asian wife, or I've never said, a racist slur and all of that. And people don't understand what internalized racism is. So technically, the killers were found not guilty of violating the civil rights. Does that mean we can't speculate that there might have been internalized racism and bias that they themselves may not know that they had? Of course we can speculate. Of course we can discuss that. I think had the case happened today, I think they would have served jail time. I think I do not think that they would have been acquitted. So there are.
Hope not.
Yeah, I think, and here's the other thing too. The one thing I did want to bring up too is that the Vincent Chin case did change law in Michigan. You can't plea bargain from second-degree murder to manslaughter anymore. The prosecutor has to show up to all the hearings. Back in the 1980s, Detroit was the murder capital of the world. The homicide rate was one of the highest in the country. So the prosecutor's office, even if they wanted to attend the hearing for Vincent Chin's killing, they didn't have anybody available. But today that's no longer excused because of Vincent Chin. Then you find someone to attend that hearing, or we will reschedule it until you can have the prosecutor there. Lily Chin didn't even know the hearing was happening. Because of Vincent Chin and other cases, we now have what is known as the victim impact statement. The families can deliver a victim impact statement at the hearing. That was so, even though Vincent Chin didn't have a voice back then, he gave the legacy of this case, gave others a voice. So I have to look at that as a win. Even though we never found justice for Vincent Chin, he's finding justice for other people. So I think that that's important to celebrate.
Well, you know, you started the conversation talking about having thought about this story as a screenplay. Now that you've written the book, are you still interested in exploring this as a film or a series of any sort?
That's a really good question, and I can't answer that right now, but hopefully you'll be hearing news soon.
Okay.
But yeah, but I'm back to that, and there are being steps being made, and fingers crossed, and we'll see. But yeah, I come back to me in a month or two.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, also, I wanted, you know, I mentioned that It's Not Fair is one of those moments that I can't get out of my head. I'm wondering, having gone through this process, is there anything that has become extraordinarily memorable for you, or just something you can't shake about this?
Yeah, and this is a good way to kind of wrap up, because I know we only have about 5 minutes left. When I heard, when I interviewed everybody, when I went and met people in their living rooms in suburban Michigan, or on the phone, or on FaceTime, I tried to do as many in-person videos, in-person interviews as I could. Every single person got angry, or cried, and it was as if Vincent had been killed the other day. This is something
Mm.
that happened almost 40 years ago. And I realized they weren't remembering what happened. They were reliving it. I was witnessing trauma happen right in front of me. And the reason why I bring that up is when I saw the live press conference where the sheriff's department said the Atlanta shooter, they were paraphrasing that he had a bad day and this was not a racist. They didn't really think this was a racist hate crime. All I could think about were all the people I interviewed for Vincent Chin and how they cried 40 years later. And I realized not only were they traumatized by the horrific, violent death of a loved one, but they were also told back in the 1980s, you don't count. When it comes to the dialogue and conversation on racism and hate, you don't count. You don't have a seat at the table. So they not only suffered trauma from the death of a loved one, but they also were told, we don't count. Our identity does not exist. We're ghosts. We're erased. We are erased from America's conversation on race. And so I thought to myself, who's going to do the book on Atlanta 40 years from now? Whoever does the book on Atlanta 40 years from now, the loved ones and the people left behind by the 8 people that were killed, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent, you're gonna witness them relive what happened. They're gonna cry and they're gonna be angry because not only were their loved ones killed, but they were also denied in the year 2021. They were denied a place at the table in terms of talking about racism. They don't count.
Mm.
And that is what I took away from writing this book, and that's what keeps my fire going, and that's why we have to know Vincent Chin's case. We need to know his story so this doesn't happen again. It happened. It happened in March, and I was so angry about that. That's what pisses me off, to be frank.
Yeah. But what is the takeaway? What do you hope is the takeaway for people who read the book?
The takeaway is half glass full, because here's the takeaway. History will always repeat itself. Hate will always come back. But you know what comes back even stronger? Love and solidarity and fighting back. So yes, history repeated itself with Atlanta, but then you know what? So did the good thing. So did the good event of all those young people and older people marching together, arm in arm, saying, stop AAPI hate, stop Asian hate. So that's what I want people to come away with, to know that unfortunately history is going to always repeat itself. So if it does, then you better repeat fighting back.
Right. Well, I think that's the best place to end it. Gary, thank you so much. And thank you so much for this time.
Well, thank you both so much, both Paul and Janice, for sharing this very illuminating conversation with us. I would like to invite all of our attendees to visit the Be the Change website to see all of our upcoming virtual events honoring Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, including the Stop the Hate series. Videos that explore, inform, and advocate against hate crimes, targeting Asian American and Pacific Islanders communities. Glendale Library Arts and Culture Reflect Space also invites you, the gallery, to explore Beyond the River, Free Zone DMZ, the city that lost the river, an exhibition that reflects on borders and divisions, specifically the far-reaching impact of the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea at Glendale's sister city, Gimpo, South Korea. See the 3D virtual gallery at reflectspace.org, which in normal times is housed in the Central Library in Glendale, but now available to everyone worldwide via the World Wide Web. Our next virtual Be the Change author event commemorates the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. On Thursday, May 27th at 6:30 p.m., author and attorney Hannibal Johnson will discuss his book, Black Wall Street 100, with actress, activist, and writer Donzale Abernathy, daughter of Ralph Abernathy. Register at glac.info/BeTheChange. Also watch the Be the Change website for information about our June events in honor of Pride Month. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and a heartfelt thanks to Paula and Janice. Please have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.